how are you going to, if you get something in the market, if you go to a friend's house, I mean, at what level are you going to go to say that I know that you have done halal? So halal trust or halal reason that situates itself in the middle to say that, well, trust in halal is kind of a suspended between absolute certainty and absolute doubt. Neither do I doubt everybody where I go around. I accept that they're Muslim, that their food is halal. And I can never really have absolute certainty about it because it's about a question of community, about relationships and trust. I was thinking about this as a kind of almost like a triadic kind of relational model, right? So you've got people interacting with each other, and then but all under some kind of divine theological will. And halal and certification comes in and changes this. So what people are doing, what you are calling vernacular piety or the counter-public, I try to argue, is that many times they're actually mobilizing an established tradition of halal. It's a tradition that's not written down, but it's so widespread. It's not written down like in one book.
That's very important to recognize, I guess, on a certain level. I think like one thing that sticks out, returning to the ethical life question, ethical life isn't seen as like grand or something, like in the modernist sense. Like it's like minor, it's affective or ordinary. Could you elaborate on that? Like how that appears in both like Mumbai and South Africa cases?
That's interesting. Yeah, so I think it ties, obviously, I mean, it ties clearly to what we were discussing now, right? They are kind of like, I think I try to think about ethical life as drawing, of course, on ordinary ethics and the anthropology of ethics that has trained us to understand that it's not often about these grand ideologies, right? Of whether you are a reformist or you're a particular sectarian group or something else, but there's also ways of like living in the world. And so we're speaking here about living halal, right? And this is this embodied sense that one has a particular relation to animals in this way. One has a relationship to the butcher, a relationship to space in a particular way, not in a static way that's always liable to change, but it's something that we often are making judgments of in very kind of everyday ways. So to give you an example is like, one day I'm in the meat market in Mumbai, in Crawford Market, and I'm spending time with a butcher who I was familiar with and used to go and visit in the mornings. And a Christian woman from elite neighborhood in Colaba is there, and she's buying her meat. And when I managed to start speaking to her, just, as we were passing, she kind of reflected on this and told me, I was just thinking, this place is smelly, the butcher is smelly, but I felt bad to cover my mouth. So she tells me, she's wearing a scarf, and she tells me, at some level, I wanted to cover my mouth with the scarf, right? But then she said, I felt bad because, I've been coming to this guy for decades. And if I did that, if I showed a sign of disgust in this space, I'm actually showing a sign of, I'm showing a disrespect to these people, to their livelihoods and things like that. And so I'm trying to argue, trying to develop this term called ethical affect, that often our ethical practices, which are always embodied, right? You cannot have actually a non-embodied ethics because that would just be a grand gesture. That is just a performative expression, which we see all the time nowadays. We are very sorry about this. We really condemn this, but we know that this is not right. So to actually have an ethics is to have an embodied place in the world. But often it happens in these very small judgments and small actions that in this example I described draw this woman and her butcher into a whole political and economic context, which is ongoing in a place like India, but which is actually evident at that very minor level of the micro interaction, and is significant for that reason, and tells us, in a way, to come back to earlier discussion, that perhaps this idea of disgust as an automatic natural response is actually quite problematic, because someone can also actually regulate their disgust in particular ways to do certain things. And that's the ethical affect. That's the point where ethics and affect meet. And I think similarly in South Africa, whether someone who, might have subscribed to a particular, say, Sanha idea of halal, but is now confronted with a mother-in-law or family member and then says, well, today I will eat the food because this is a gift. This is about a community. This is about another kind of value. So, I'm still obviously working on my book and I'm trying to complete it, but I'm trying to think about, to develop this idea that to study everyday life and to study whatever we study is very important to pay attention to these micro interactions, which are often saturated with affect, with gestures, with facial movements, with bodily aversions, right? Things we obviously learn from people like Fanon and many others, but which happen all the time and that tell us a lot about the society. They tell us a lot about political, obviously, and the ritual, the religious, and perhaps also they can be a way for us to turn back on ourselves, to turn back on how are we valuing things around us? What are we actually standing for, or what are we doing? And I guess that's this whole otherwise. But yeah, maybe it's too ephemeral for now. But
Yeah, so you also wrote this really like fascinating piece on the material semiotics of halal and neoliberal Islam. And I found that kind of fascinating because it shifts from like questions of bodily practice to the symbolic and semiotic life of halal, where it's like looking at logos, labels, digital alerts that convey trust, purity, and Islamic legitimacy. Can you speak about how halal operates in a communicative economy, not just a religious one?
Yeah, no, that's extremely important. I think what I'm trying to also suggest, right, is that when we approach it like that, right, we have a communicative economy versus the religious one, we're missing the point, right? So halal, and there's actually something I've been working on with some friends who are in linguistic anthropologists who have helped me a lot. It'll come out soon. Hopefully it'll come out, language and communication. Yeah, if we think
Yeah.
about halal, like how I described it to you, right, as something, as trust, as firstly a set of ritual practices, a set of kind of question of reason that tie people, animals, trade, the divine, all kinds of complicated relations. It is actually itself, it is somehow a communicative practice. It is some kind of communicative practice, right? From the utterance, which is a performative expression of God's permission, the tasmiyah to take the animal, to the kind of, to that moment where people meet each other and a sign, or just knowing that you are a Muslim or knowing that you're someone's house immediately communicates that this is halal, that now we've entered a mode of relational trust, which we all understand to be at play here. So in a sense, when we enter this new world of labeling, of logos, of branding, of this commercialization, we are actually seeing a transformation in the ways, in the values, in the form, but the form and the content of what is actually being communicated. And that for me became extremely interesting. For example, like how we spoke about taqwa. So
Yeah.
the Islamic finance can advertise, a sports car and a skyscraper as somehow halal finance compliant. I think one has to look at not just that as a communicative practice, but what kinds of values are actually being communicated, being produced, and being performed in this particular new mode, right? And as opposed to, say, like we discussed with taqwa, idea of abstinence or self-control. So that's what I try to do in a sense. I'm trying to do in this halal work now, which I'm still obviously thinking about, but trying to then, if one takes halal as a pragmatic discourse itself, then what does it mean to put halal pragmatics into conversation with advertising pragmatics or the pragmatics of, the neoliberal economy? And what kind of, obviously, sometimes things merge quite smoothly with this whole new kind of neoliberal halal economy. But I'm also interested in those breaks. I'm particularly interested in the breaks and the conflicts, because I think at the moments where the things break down, where the communication fails, where the claim of halal, this being halal, people say, why is Coca-Cola halal?
Yeah.
Why is McDonald's halal when they are feeding, Israeli soldiers in the middle of, a violent moment? Those are the interesting moments which actually allow us to see what kind of values are at stake for the world we live in, but also the world we want, right? The place we want to live in.
Yeah, I feel like this question also relates to sort of how it's producing a new form of religiosity, right? One that's responsive to global capital and consumer branding, as you're saying. But it's also interesting. I wonder how it impacts, what kind of Muslim subject is being called into being. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that really gets to the heart of this question, right? Because if we pay attention to these fissures or these issues, then we are also become alert to the kinds of subjects, right? The kinds of values, the kind of world. And it's something that, yeah, that one recognizes that we're all in the world. We sit today on this kind of technological media, using these headphones to have this conversation. So we are in many ways always interpolated, right, or brought into the world. But at the same time, one needs to be quite critical, right? So the kind of Muslim consumer subject who, kind of conforms to the general ideas of value maximization, wealth creation, individual consumerism is something which I think early on, trained in things like anthropology, we are just there to analyze. But later on, especially spending time in Mumbai, with a marginal community, with a different kind of, it makes one wonder, okay, well, what's actually happening here? What are we doing by simply accepting various iterations of being as all somehow the same? And what kinds of values? And also, what kind of subject, this consumer subject, what are the values of this consumer subject? Does the consumer subject recognize the implication, say, of global trade and finance with various kinds of global injustices? Or are they actually a subject that's just simply compartmentalizing, as we often see in this kind of, in this world that's designed to be fractured? So, yeah, I think we need to be quite critical, right, of the Muslim consumer subject, of the Muslim subject. And I think that's where this whole thing of discursive tradition, of looking at histories, at looking at, contestations, I think gives us that sense. So we recognize not one way of being, but we also have to, people also, I think we have to make ourselves, right, and each other, the world, not only Muslims, is accountable for what actually is going on. And so that's what I try to, I don't know if that,
No, that's yeah. And another point is you're referring to it as like a kind of moral capital that circulates, and and like a brand, and it generates a kind of legitimacy, but also the competition, suspicion, and even scandal. Do you see parallels here with how, say, Islamic finance or modest fashion operates, where the language of piety becomes like sort of indistinguishable from the language of the market?
Yeah, I think no, definitely. I'm more familiar with Islamic finance. I mean, the kind of language and just debates around that. But I think that's a very good example, right? It's a kind of a form which, which satisfies certain kinds of technical questions around contracts, around, interest, of course, but at the same time also generates so many, so many critiques, and quite fundamental critiques, right? Of what is the aims, what is the point actually of Islamic finance? If you are going to produce a shopping mall, with, again, global brands where small traders are not available, where various kinds of barriers to entry operate, then I think that, that kind of opens up this question, right? But I mean, it's not absolute, right? Because I mean, I think it's not absolute. It's like, we do have the problem of scale. We do have certain things. I also think, I don't know, it wasn't so clear, but I also think we can recognize the problems, but not only give in to a kind of a practical solution. Well, we need this in order to basically, in order to, I don't know, fit into this whole new world. And I guess, in that sense, I'm trying to think ethically, right? So we as anthropologists, scholars, everyone need to think quite ethically, right? About our politics and about...
So if there's a thread to bring this all together and wrap up this like amazing interview, in your view, to take minor forms of ethical life seriously as sites of critique and refusal and world making, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, I think that's what I'm trying to figure out. But I think for me, what it means to me is that first, it requires a certain kind of a suspension, both of our own moral and ethical presuppositions that we come with from our place, but also of the ones that are lodged in the very scholarship that we read. So we need a kind of a suspicion towards what we come with, both in our scholarship and in ourselves, and a willingness to actually listen. It means a willingness to listen very carefully, like you say, to these minor forms of life. The challenge, what it actually means, so you've already told me that, sorry. But the challenge then, what it actually means, I think, is that we need to be able to situate these minor forms of life in their larger context. And then, so once we've situated the larger context, and then find connections in our conceptual repertoire between what is happening in people's lives, what's happening in the world of politics and economic policies and things, and in the world of anthropology, the social sciences, humanities. And that kind of suturing or bringing together can be quite productive, because it can open us up to values or ways of thinking about values at large that we may not have actually thought about. At the same time, we may not have even given it some thought in our kind of moral, ethical, and theoretical imagination. But at the same time, it also I think requires us to let certain things slide. So The people you may work with may be able to teach you a lot about, say, in my case, the ethics of food, of food processes, how things work from their perspective, from their space. They may have much less to say about gender education,
Yeah.
right? Because of who they are as men, masculine butchers in the space, right? There are certain limitations. So it also requires one to recognize the limitations of people as subjects who are not perfect in their way, but who nevertheless can teach us something and that we can learn from.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people who are doing this kind of work, so we are just trying to contribute a little bit to that.
This has been an amazing conversation. Dr. Shaheed Tayob, thank you for this layered, wide-ranging conversation. Your work shows us how Muslims live ethics, not just through belief, but through textures of care, critique, and survival.